The day the Nazi brain was murdered in a brutal ambush. In 1942, Reinhard Heydrich was one of the most feared men in the Nazi regime. He led the Reich security police, controlled intelligence, and governed Bohemia and Moravia. From that position, thousands of people were executed under his command, and the mass deportation of Jews to the east was set in motion. With direct access to Hitler and the freedom to act without oversight, fear became a method of governance in the territories under his control. His decisions altered the political balance of Central Europe and triggered forces that could not reveal themselves openly. Unbeknownst to him, that same power placed him at the center of an operation that would mark an entire country. What was the life and death of the most powerful man under occupation like? The Sudetenlands as an excuse, cross-espionage, and the delivery of a country. When Hitler began to implement his European domination project, internal tensions within German power started to spill outward. The rivalry between the Abwehr and the SD, between the regular army and the SS, did not remain within the Reich's borders. This clash of ambitions became particularly visible in Czechoslovakia, one of the first countries struck by Nazi expansion. The Czechoslovak state, created after the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, included a large German-speaking population settled in the border areas adjacent to Hitler's Germany. In 1938, the complaints of these Sudeten Germans were used by the regime as an excuse to intervene in Central Europe. Czechoslovakia was no ordinary target. It had a well-equipped army, a modern industry, and a strategic position that made it a threat to be eliminated before the Great War Hitler already had in mind. Furthermore, he saw the Czech lands as part of the German Lebensraum lost by the Habsburgs. In May 1938, before senior military officials, Hitler made his decision to destroy Czechoslovakia through armed action clear. Himmler and Heydrich became key players in that plan. At the center of the Sudeten question was Konrad Henlein, a nondescript-looking gymnastics teacher who rose to notoriety when the economic crisis of the early 1930s sparked Sudeten unrest. His initial goal was to achieve broad autonomy from the Prague government. Henlein accepted Nazi funding, but at the same time sought support outside Germany. Thanks to his contacts with the Sudeten landed aristocracy, he established links with the British Foreign Office and was invited to London in 1935 and 1937. His idea was to play with Germany's rise and Britain's fear of war to impose his own project. This strategy earned him the SS's hatred. Heydrich saw him as an unreliable figure and distrusted his contacts in London. From there, he decided to weaken Henlein and turn his movement into an obedient tool of Nazi expansionism. To achieve this, Heydrich sought allies within the radical wing of the Sudeten movement, which favored direct union with the Reich. This faction was led by Karl Hermann Frank, a one-eyed bookseller from Karlovy Vary who would be tied to Heydrich throughout his career. Frank combined intelligence with a destructive obsession marked by resentment. His goal was to humiliate and eliminate the Czechs as a people, which made him an ideal collaborator for the SS's plans. While strengthening ties with Frank, Heydrich attacked Henlein and his circle. He accused him of acting as a British agent and fostered maneuvers against his leadership. According to Heinz Jost, head of the SD's foreign espionage, Henlein was placed under permanent surveillance and an SD office was opened in Dresden. In November 1937, Heinz Ruther, one of Henlein's main advisors, was arrested by the Czech police on charges of homosexual offenses and was found dead 2 weeks later. After Austria's annexation in March 1938, Ottmar Spann was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to a concentration camp. While Heydrich maneuvered with Frank, Henlein had the backing of Admiral Canaris and the Abwehr. Canaris supported Sudeten self-determination but was unwilling to provoke a war. He feared that the alliance between Heydrich and the radicals would push Germany into a conflict for which it was unprepared. For this reason, he tried to strengthen Henlein's position against his rivals. This task fell to Abwehr Abteilung II, led by Major Helmut Grosskirch. Grosskirch organized weapons depots, gathered information on Czech defenses, and trained sabotage groups while seeking a negotiated solution. Although he achieved some progress, by early 1938 the balance tilted in Heydrich's favor. Pressured by the radicals and encouraged by Hitler's success in Austria, Henlein gave in. After meeting with Hitler in March 1938, he agreed to exaggerate Sudeten complaints to provide a pretext for war. Czechoslovakia faced this threat under the presidency of Edward Bénez. A former collaborator of Tomáš Masaryk, Bénez had worked during World War I to gain international recognition for the Czech state and in 1935 succeeded Masaryk as president. He advocated a unitary state and resisted granting autonomy to the Sudeten Germans and Slovaks for fear of the country's dissolution. Convinced that survival depended on active foreign policy, he supported the use of intelligence as a key tool. Since 1935, Czech military intelligence had been headed by František Moravec. Upon assuming the position, Moravec found an ineffective service unaware of the German threat. He reformed the organization, increased the budget, and directed all efforts toward the Reich. Within a few years, Czech intelligence achieved significant results and gained a reputation in Europe. Moravec collaborated closely with the British Secret Service. From 1936, Czech intelligence provided high-level information to London. In this context, a key agent emerged, known as A54, who in 1937 offered German mobilization plans in exchange for money. A54 turned out to be Paul Tümmel, a member of the Abwehr in Dresden with access to sensitive information. His motivations were never clear, but his information was crucial until his arrest in 1942. Despite these efforts, Bénez failed to mobilize international support in 1938. During the Munich crisis, Britain and France accepted the cession of the Sudetenlands. Bénez was excluded from the conference and chose not to fight alone. After his resignation, he left the country and prepared for exile. The new government accommodated Berlin and subordinated its policy to the Reich. Moravec was monitored and threatened, and he decided to move military intelligence abroad. Thanks to A54's information and British support, he organized a secret escape in March 1939, taking key files and officers out of the country before the German occupation. As troops entered Prague, the Czech intelligence structure survived in exile. With the proclamation of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and the appointment of Karl Hermann Frank as head of the police under Heydrich, the country was subdued. However, at the same time, resistance began to form abroad, determined to recover the lost state. Occupying the law, stolen telegrams and seized police stations. Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933 opened a legal path to power and shifted politics from the streets to state offices. The regime would not be overthrown by force, but occupied from within. Himmler and Heydrich understood very early that in this new scenario, the SS and the SD were still too small to impose their ambitions alone. The future depended on taking positions within the state bureaucracy and seizing a key point to shape it as their own tool. Attention immediately turned to the police, especially the political police, an area that allowed secret action and the implementation of extraordinary measures. In Weimar Germany, there was no unified police force, but a network of forces controlled by regional governments. Himmler and Heydrich's goal was to centralize the system and merge it with the SS to create a force directly subordinated to the Führer. This apparatus would guarantee the SS a dominant position and could be used against both external enemies and internal rivals. In January 1933, Heydrich temporarily left the SD's leadership to join Himmler's team and focus entirely on implementing this plan. The small intelligence organization was put on the back burner while its creators concentrated on capturing the levers of state power. The path was not easy. After January 1933, the center of political action shifted from Munich to Berlin, where Hitler maneuvered to consolidate his authority against the traditional conservatives who had brought him to power. In this phase, Himmler and Heydrich were sidelined. Without a prominent role within the party, they remained in Bavaria while key decisions were made in the capital. Bavaria did not yet have a Nazi government, and the regional prime minister threatened to resist any dismissal attempts, while the political police continued to pursue the Nazis. In early 1933, the only official offer for Heydrich was a post as a security expert in the German delegation at the Geneva Disarmament Conference. The diplomatic environment awakened in him a deep contempt for the Versailles system and what he considered the weakness of old Germany. The episode ended abruptly when he was called back after hoisting a huge swastika flag at his hotel in defiance of local authorities. The situation changed after the March 1933 elections, when the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, eliminating the last remnants of the parliamentary system and granting Hitler almost absolute power. Only then did the new Führer feel secure enough to dismiss the Bavarian government and appoint a Nazi commissioner. Heydrich, eager to ensure the order reached its destination, stormed the central post office and seized the telegram at gunpoint. Soon after, a caravan of vehicles occupied Munich's official buildings, including police headquarters, without encountering resistance. The Bavarian security system was immediately reorganized. Himmler assumed leadership of the political police, with Heydrich as his deputy. From the start, Heydrich retained many experienced officials instead of purging them. Among them was Heinrich Müller, who would later gain notoriety as head of the Gestapo. This new force was used to crush any opposition in Bavaria. Political leaders, trade unionists, and members of the Jewish community were arrested and sent to the newly created Dachau camp. By late 1933, more than 16,000 people had passed through its fences. Many were released after brief detention to spread fear. Himmler, however, maintained control of the system by denying Heydrich authority over Dachau, which remained in the hands of Theodor Eicke. From Bavaria, Himmler and Heydrich extended their control to other German states. Prussia remained the major obstacle. There, power was in the hands of Hermann Göring, who strengthened his dominance by controlling the Prussian police and created the Gestapo, separating it from legal oversight. Himmler's representative in Berlin, Kurt Daluege, aligned with Göring. When Heydrich attempted to intervene, he was expelled from Prussia without mercy. Göring proclaimed that neither Himmler nor Heydrich would ever reach Berlin. Internal rivalries within the regime soon offered an opportunity. Although Hitler avoided confronting the army, this caution irritated Ernst Röhm, head of the SA, who demanded a second revolution and aspired to control the armed forces. His ambitions alarmed the generals and Göring. In April 1934, Göring ceded control of the Gestapo to Himmler in exchange for SS support against Röhm. Heydrich organized the operation. On June 30, 1934, the purge was unleashed. Röhm was arrested and executed along with numerous SA leaders. The operation consolidated SS power and definitively sidelined the brownshirts. After the purge, Himmler and Heydrich's positions strengthened. The Gestapo was reorganized nationwide and the police were removed from judicial control. In 1936, Himmler was appointed head of all German police. Heydrich assumed leadership of the security police. In 1939, all these agencies were grouped under the Reich Main Security Office, reinforcing his personal authority. From then on, the police functioned as a political weapon. They were granted power to detain without trial and the ability to send prisoners directly to the camps. Under Heydrich's direction, the persecution policy evolved into mass deportation. In 1941, he received the order to coordinate the so-called Final Solution, and in January 1942 presided over the Wannsee Conference. At the same time, Heydrich consolidated his image within the SS as a symbol of toughness and discipline. He cultivated the figure of a member of a warrior elite, while his character became dominated by obsession with power. All his abilities were at the service of a system of control and repression unprecedented in scope, designed to sustain the absolute domination of the Nazi regime. London in the shadows, hidden transmitters and authority at stake. The first Czechoslovak intelligence corps in exile was established on Rosendale Road in West Dulwich, under the cover of a small radio shop run by a British agent named Reg Adams. This group, known as Moravec's First 11, worked almost exclusively with the British Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, according to the unwritten agreement that had allowed their arrival in London. When the French intelligence service proposed close cooperation, Moravec responded politely but closed off any possibility. He had not forgotten what had happened in Munich or France's stance in 1938. With the Soviets, the situation was similar, and contact ceased after the signing of the German-Soviet Pact in August 1939. Moravec did not see himself as a mere executor of British orders. He was a committed nationalist who believed his organization should serve a legitimate Czechoslovak authority oriented toward restoring independence. He was willing to collaborate with the British, but not to subordinate himself to them. For him, only one person could lead and give purpose to a government in exile, Edward Beans. Upon arriving in London, he wrote to inform Beans of his presence and to make his entire team available. Benes, the former president, had already resumed public speeches from the United States, denouncing the Nazi occupation of Prague and affirming that Czechoslovak independence had not been destroyed. He immediately accepted the offer and announced his relocation to London. By the end of July 1939, Benes settled in a modest suburban house in Putney, far from the Hradčany castle now occupied by the German Reichsprotector. Nevertheless, he trusted that the coming war would end Hitler and allow the liberation of his country, and he was determined to defend the Czech cause before the Allies. From the start, the task was difficult. Benes maintained that Germany's aggression in March 1939 had invalidated the Munich Agreement and that the Republic still existed within its original borders. He also asserted that he remained president, despite his forced resignation in October 1938. These positions were not well received in either London or Paris. While Britain and France did not fully recognize the legality of the German occupation, they were also unwilling to annul Munich or formally recognize him. He was allowed to reside in London on the condition of not engaging in political activities, a restriction lifted once war broke out. Meanwhile, young Czechs began leaving the Protectorate to fight abroad. Some crossed into Poland at night, others posed as Sudeten Germans to pass through Austria and reach Yugoslavia. Many ended up in France, first enlisted in the Foreign Legion and later transferred to a new Czech unit established in Agde on the Mediterranean coast, under General Inger's command. Treatment by the French command was poor. Soldiers lost their uniforms, received outdated equipment, lacked sufficient weapons, and even had to use wooden clogs. Frustration grew among men who had risked their lives to fight and found themselves sidelined. In December 1939, the Allies recognized a national council led by Benes as the representative of the Czechoslovak peoples, an ambiguous formula that avoided committing to full restoration of the state. The position was still inferior to that of other governments in exile. Internal tensions increased and the atmosphere among exiles became tense. The liaison with the Foreign Office was Robert Bruce Lockhart, a former diplomat experienced in Prague and sympathetic to the Czech cause, though with limited influence within the British bureaucracy. Benes and his foreign minister Jan Masaryk pushed for stronger recognition, convinced it would strengthen both the army and the internal resistance. For months, their efforts had no effect, and the situation remained deadlocked. One of Benes's main supports was Moravec and his intelligence network. Thanks to transmitters provided with British assistance, he was able to establish contact with the underground resistance in the Protectorate, known as the Mafia. This link gave him political legitimacy and a key resource with the Allies. Benes closely guarded this channel and used the proximity between Moravec and the British services to consolidate his position within the exile. Part of the funds received through the SYS was discreetly diverted to political purposes. Another decisive asset was the source known as a 54, who provided information from inside the German apparatus. Although Benes doubted its absolute reliability, he used the reports cautiously, always considering the effect they would have in London. During the so-called phony war, some British sectors began to take an interest in the potential of an organized Czech resistance. Both the SIS and sections of the British Army explored possibilities for sabotage and covert warfare. Colonel Colin Gubbins and other officers maintained contact with Moravec, transmitting requests and strategic assessments. However, until 1940, interest was limited. The fall of France changed the scenario. With Britain isolated, any ally gained value. In July 1940, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, was created, with the mission of fostering sabotage and subversion in occupied Europe. In this context, the Czech cause gained weight, and shortly thereafter, Britain recognized the provisional Czechoslovak government. Benes received the news as a first tangible achievement. After the bombings of London, Benes relocated to Aston Abbotts, from where he continued to govern cautiously. Although he now had provisional recognition, he aspired to more. The formal annulment of Munich was still pending and crucial for his plans for the country's future. Moravec reorganized his communications after the destruction of his Dulwich base and established a new center in Surrey, maintaining Czech operational control. At the same time, the intelligence network continued to provide relevant information on German plans, including the planned invasion of Britain. In the Protectorate, the resistance, coordinated by the UVOD organization, remained active despite arrests. Beans encouraged a strategy based on discreet sabotage, passive resistance, and intelligence, avoiding spectacular actions that would provoke reprisals. This policy allowed both the clandestine network and the government in exile's authority to be preserved, although the balance remained fragile and dependent on factors that would soon change with the expansion of the war in Eastern Europe. Leamington Spa, volunteers chosen for no-return missions. On a freezing day in October 1940, the 3,000 men of the Czechoslovak Brigade arrived in the English town of Leamington Spa in Warwickshire. The headquarters, under General Miroslav, was established in a large Victorian house in the town centre, while the units were distributed in barracks and requisitioned residences nearby. The journey had been long and arduous, from the heart of Europe to an unfamiliar region of England, and with winter approaching, no one knew if they would ever see home again. The brigade had landed in Britain 3 months earlier, marked by bitterness and discouragement. In May 1940, the Czechs had been thrown into combat in France without proper preparation or equipment and were caught in the collapse of the French army. After the June 17th surrender, many soldiers with families in France returned to Agde and were demobilized. The rest, exiles who could not risk falling into Gestapo hands, decided to flee to Britain to continue the fight. Under General Inger's orders, these men retreated toward the Mediterranean coast along roads crowded with refugees and scattered remnants of the French army, while in London, Bernays pressured the British authorities to provide evacuation ships. The brigade was nearly abandoned amid the chaos. The situation was saved thanks to Lockhart's intervention, who leveraged contacts at the Admiralty. The men embarked without their heavy equipment but with deep contempt for France, which they held responsible for a double betrayal, Munich and the military defeat. From the port of Liverpool, the troops were sent to Cholmondeley Park near Chester to reorganize. The psychological impact was severe. An atmosphere of frustration and defeat prevailed, leading to internal conflicts. A group of soldiers accused the political and military leadership of their situation and demanded discharge. In total, 480 men refused to obey orders. The news alarmed British security services, especially MI5, which feared the presence of hundreds of disgruntled foreigners on the eve of a possible German invasion. Moravec attributed the mutiny to communist influence, a view shared by British authorities. Although Benz avoided pointing fingers directly, the involved were temporarily interned and later assigned to the Pioneer Corps. Benz requested that the episode be silenced to avoid damaging the brigade's morale and his own legitimacy. In August 1940, the Provisional Government signed a military agreement with Britain. A liaison mission was assigned, and the force was reorganized according to the British model. After the initial incidents, morale improved. The brigade was not an elite unit, but it represented an army of volunteers who had sacrificed everything for their country. The soldiers were driven by 2 main motivations. The first was the desire to build a different Czechoslovakia after the war, not merely restore the old pre-Munich state. The second was a deep hatred of Germany, fueled by the humiliation suffered and the guilt of being safe while the population at home lived under repression. Only by fighting and returning as victors could they come back with dignity. During the winter of 1940 and spring of 1941, that possibility seemed distant. However, the opportunity to strike the enemy was beginning to take shape. In April 1941, a Humber car arrived at the brigade headquarters in Leamington Spa. Inside was Major Emil Strankmüller, Moravec's deputy. His mission was to recruit candidates for special operations. The requirements were clear: patriotism, self-control, discretion, and absolute willingness. It was clandestine work. At the beginning of May, 36 names were submitted. The candidates were interviewed, and it was emphasized that the decision had to be voluntary, given the mission's danger. By mid-month, the first group was sent for parachute training at Wilmslow Air Base. The plan, developed together with the SOE, envisioned sending 3-man teams to the Protectorate to reinforce communications and intelligence. These groups would be deployed in autumn 1941. The initiative responded to clear political needs of Benz, maintaining contact with the internal resistance, ensuring information flow, and retaining control over the UVOD clandestine council in anticipation of the war's imminent expansion. A previous attempt to deploy a radio operator, Operation Benjamin, had failed in April 1941 due to a navigation error. The long, clear nights of spring prevented new flights. Urgency increased when the Gestapo intensified repression before Barbarossa, demonstrating the fragility of communications. The German invasion of the Soviet Union confirmed to Benes that the war would expand. The rapid German advance caused alarm, but the USSR's entry transformed the diplomatic landscape. In July 1941, Moscow fully recognized the Czechoslovak government in exile and declared the Munich Agreement void. Shortly thereafter, Britain did the same. This progress came at a price. Benes knew he had to contribute visibly to the Allied war effort. Intelligence was no longer enough. Pressure increased to take action, both from Moscow and London. After weeks of hesitation, Benes yielded. In August 1941, zones for drops and reception teams were ordered to be prepared. The plan sought limited actions, avoiding mass reprisals, but demonstrating commitment to the Allies. Meanwhile, training continued in Britain. Agents underwent courses in parachuting, sabotage, and radio. There was no extraction plan. Those deployed would remain in hiding until liberation or death. Among the selected men were two non-commissioned officers, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubis. Both shared a profound motivation: to erase the humiliation of Munich and face the occupier directly. On August 16, 1941, they left Leamington Spa to begin extreme training. They were destined for sabotage, but events would soon push them toward a different mission, one that would irrevocably link them to Reinhard Heydrich's fate. Forced production, 12-hour shifts, and control from the castle. While Benes's agents continued waiting in Britain, the military situation took a sharp turn. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a counter-offensive near Moscow that forced German forces to retreat. Almost simultaneously, the conflict expanded decisively. On December 7th, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. Germany, unable to achieve a quick victory in the East, was forced to mobilize new human and economic resources to sustain a prolonged war. Faced with the crisis, Hitler assumed direct control of military operations and dismissed numerous senior officers. Generals were reduced to mere transmitters of orders. The army had to be rebuilt by incorporating new contingents and relying on forced labor from occupied territories. On January 10, 1942, Hitler ordered maximum production to re-equip the forces destined for the Eastern Front, even though German industry was still far below actual needs. When the Russian campaign began in June 1941, Heydrich had ridiculed those who doubted a swift victory. Hitler proclaimed that the Soviet enemy was on the verge of collapse, and Heydrich shared this view, convinced that the conquered territories would be colonized by the Reich. However, by late November, it became clear that Operation Barbarossa was not progressing as planned. Heydrich did not abandon his ideological project, but understood it needed to be postponed. Aware that his political future depended on impressing Hitler, Heydrich acted quickly. The Protectorate had to adapt to a prolonged war through a total reorganization of the economy and political apparatus. Behind a facade of autonomy, Bohemia and Moravia would be fully integrated into the Reich's war economy. The SS had always considered the Protectorate government a dangerous vestige of former Czech independence. Upon arriving in Prague, Heydrich deliberately ignored the Czech ministers, leaving them disoriented and fearful of ending up like Elias. He saw this uncertainty as a necessary preliminary step for political restructuring. On November 16th, he informed Bormann that the regime had to be reorganized to gradually eliminate Czech autonomy from within. When Barbarossa stalled before Moscow, Heydrich took action. The Protectorate government was transformed into an executive instrument subordinate to Prague Castle. It would no longer be a body for channeling Czech complaints, but a direct extension of the Reichsprotector. In the new system, ministers did not deliberate. They executed instructions and only discussed how to implement them. A central element of the reform was the creation of the Ministry of Labor and Economy, headed by the German technocrat Walter Berch, who acted as Heydrich's informant within the cabinet. The Ministry of Education and Propaganda, led by Emanuel Moravec, was tasked with the psychological mobilization of the population in favor of the German war effort. Moravec, a former nationalist turned collaborator, was considered by Heydrich a useful tool. Moravec was to reform the education system to produce more compliant workers for German industry. Harcher accepted these changes under pressure, and the new cabinet was announced on January 19, 1942. During the ceremony, Prime Minister Heydrich promised that his government would give everything for Germany's final victory. In return, Heydrich lifted martial law in Prague and Brno and released some students imprisoned since 1939, sending the message that collaboration had rewards. In the following months, Heydrich oversaw a deep industrial reorganization. Companies were closed or merged, and over 100,000 workers were reassigned through a system of labor conscription. From late 1941, Czechs could be sent to work anywhere in Germany, and tens of thousands were relocated to the Reich. In February 1942, the 8-hour workday was suspended and 12-hour shifts were imposed to increase production. The SS had a direct interest in this process. Himmler had spent years expanding his economic empire in the Protectorate, and the pace accelerated under Heydrich. Companies linked to the SS received lucrative contracts, and in March 1942, Himmler attempted to divert Skoda production to the Waffen-SS, causing administrative chaos that even Albert Speer criticized. To soften the impact of the long shifts, Heydrich made superficial concessions. In April 1942, Social Security was reformed and benefits were increased. May Day was declared a holiday, and vacations and entertainment were offered to selected workers. Propaganda presented Heydrich as a defender of workers, though the real objective was to increase production. At the same time, Emanuel Moravec launched an attack on secondary education. With universities closed since 1939, the aim was to reduce secondary education and establish a compulsory youth service. Everything served Heydrich's ultimate goal: Germanization, deportation, and extermination. In secret speeches, he explained that part of the youth would be absorbed by Germany and the rest sent east. A racial registry of the population was implemented under the guise of administrative checks. New identity documents and medical examinations provided the SS with the necessary data. At the same time, a reinterpretation of Czech history was promoted, designed to deny the existence of a distinct nation. Heydrich's success increased pressure on the exiles in London. Benes feared that the Protectorate's visible collaboration would ruin any future aspirations. In December 1941, he publicly broke with Harcher and declared on the BBC that no legitimate government existed in Prague. He signed the Declaration of the United Nations on January 1, 1942, but understood that symbolic gestures were not enough. To survive politically, he needed action. With the internal resistance devastated, the paratroopers became the core of any sabotage plan. In January 1942, new missions were added, including operations against prominent collaborators, and an attempt was made to coordinate an air attack on Skoda factories. In this context, Group Silver A became the only operational link with the Protectorate. After landing in the wrong location and overcoming initial errors, they managed to establish themselves in Pardubice and resume communications with London. They reported a climate of terror, strict police controls, and constant surveillance. Despite warnings, Benes insisted on sending more groups. A priority was to locate Anthropoid, missing since their drop. The lack of news caused concern in London, and Moravec ordered Silver A to find Gabčík and Kubis. Anthropoid had survived by chance. During the drop, Gabčík injured his foot and the plane had dropped them far from the planned point. With no immediate contacts, they hid in an abandoned quarry. A gamekeeper discovered the parachutes, and after admitting they had come from England, they asked for help. A miller linked to the resistance put them in contact with Prague, where they were provided with shelters and false documents. The support network was led by Ladislav Vanek, known as Jindra. After confirming their identities, he placed them under the protection of Jan Zelenka. Thanks to this network, Gabčík and Kubis obtained new identities, ration cards, and shelter. Their main hideout was the Moravec family home in the Žižkov district, where they remained hidden without ever revealing the true objective of their mission. By late February 1942, Valchik managed to locate them, and London was informed that Anthropoid was still active. At the same time, Silva, a re-established contact with Paul Tummel, source A54, although the Gestapo was already closing in. Tummel was arrested that same month and eliminated by the SS. With his fall, the Czechs lost a key source of information, and Heydrich's position was further strengthened. From that moment on, All hopes of the exile were tied to sabotage and assassination. Pressure increased, Valkyk joined the anthropoid group, and time began to run out. Any mistake could destroy the entire network and cause the plan to fail before execution. Following the target, schedules, routes, and an impossible escape. When the agents began preparing the operation, the first thing they needed was solid information about Reinhard Heydrich. He moved constantly and spent long periods away from Prague, so without reliable data on his routine and movements, it was impossible to pinpoint a place and time to kill him. At first, Gabčík and Kubis tried to gather information by watching the road between Heydrich's residence in Panenské Brezany and the capital. They left before dawn and returned hours later, soaked and covered in mud after hiding among hedges and ditches. Even so, what they observed was incomplete. To complete the picture, they needed information from inside. Although Hradčany Castle was surrounded by SSS guards, internal security was surprisingly lax. The Nazis employed Czech domestic staff and paid little attention to their movements. With the help of Jan Zelenka, the paratroopers were introduced to František Šafarik, a carpenter who worked on the castle maintenance team. Married with a young child, Šafarik was initially frightened by the questions of these unknown young men, but eventually calmed down. Šafarik took Gabčík and Kubis to the square in front of the castle near the Matthias Gate and pointed out Heydrich's car and the SS guard posts. To avoid putting himself at risk, he avoided meeting them directly thereafter. From that moment on, he acted through intermediaries, 2 girls that Zelenka had placed in a nearby apartment. Every night, Šafarik left a note with Heydrich's movements and specified whether he was traveling alone or with an escort. Unbeknownst to Šafarik, the paratroopers had a second source. Josef Novotny, a watchmaker responsible for maintaining the castle clocks, entered all the rooms of the building and repaired watches for the German garrison, allowing him to overhear conversations and gather useful rumors. Contacts were also established in Panenské Brezany, where the Heydrich family employed Czech staff whom they did not consider a risk. With all this information, the paratroopers were able to reconstruct Heydrich's daily schedule and began looking for a suitable ambush site. It soon became clear that they could not kill him at the castle or at his residence, both too well protected. Trained to attack a moving vehicle, Gabčík and Kubis focused on Heydrich's movements between Panenské Brezany, Prague, and the airport. On those routes, he was more vulnerable because he usually traveled without an escort. The challenge was finding a suitable point along his usual route. Several options were studied, but all were discarded. Attacking in central Prague was too dangerous. The only viable alternative was the rural road between Prague and Panenské Brezany. After detailed reconnaissance, they chose a wooded section where the action would end before the guards could intervene. The drawback was that the road was straight and allowed the driver to go at high speed. To stop the car, they obtained a steel cable with the help of a fitter from a Prague factory. The plan was to stretch it across the road to force the Mercedes to stop. Then, Heydrich and the driver would be finished off with firearms and grenades. The real problem was the escape. The terrain offered no hiding places or ways to flee, and after the attack, the area would be cordoned off. Still, the men did not intend to die if they could avoid it. Both had started relationships in the city, and with bicycles as their only means of transport, the chances of escape were minimal. They tried to improve the situation by obtaining a car for the getaway, to be driven by Valkyk, but in wartime Prague, that was nearly impossible. The plan was revised again and again, always running into the same obstacle. At this point, new orders arrived from London. On March 28th, 2 new groups were dropped. Zinc, intended to reinforce communications, and Outdistance, tasked with carrying a beacon to guide British bombers to the Skoda factory. From the start, everything went wrong. Bad weather disoriented the pilot, and the agents were dropped far from their targets. Zinc fell in Slovakia. Its leader escaped after a confrontation, losing documents and money. One member managed to reach Pardubice, another surrendered to the Czech police and was handed over to the Gestapo, revealing the radio team's hideout. Outdistance suffered a similar fate. One of its men lost his life after being located, and the beacon was found and delivered to the authorities. Benes tried to salvage something from the disaster. It was decided to involve Anthropoid in an operation against Skoda. Gabčík, Kubis, and Valkyk traveled to Plzeň with Opalka. Without the beacon, the attack failed. The agents returned to Prague frustrated at having risked their lives without results. By the end of April, more groups arrived, mostly for sabotage, and nearly all were captured or killed. Confiscated materials confirmed the strategy's failure. On May 21st, a request was made to cancel further drops. In this context, the very purpose of Anthropoid was questioned. The resistance feared massive reprisals and tried to halt the operation. Meetings and messages were sent to London, but the order was never explicitly cancelled. Time, however, was running out. On May 26th, Heydrich attended a concert in Prague. That same night, Gabčík and Kubis checked their weapons. The following morning, 5 months after their arrival, they would carry out their mission. September 1941 in Prague. Purges, terror, and the chosen target. The appointment of Reinhard Heydrich as acting Reichsprotector marked the beginning of the final phase of his career. It was not a casual decision, but the result of an internal conspiracy with two clear victims, Konstantin von Neurath, the official protector whom the SS considered weak, and Karl Hermann Frank, whose ambition was used by Heydrich as a tool for his own rise. In the summer of 1941, while German forces advanced toward Moscow, Heydrich began thinking about his future within the Nazi Empire. Directing the security police was no longer enough. He wanted to stop being the regime's silent executor and become a central figure of European power. Bohemia and Moravia were the first step. If he could subjugate the Czechs, greater opportunities in the occupied eastern territories would open up. His ambitions coincided with the SS's interests. Himmler wanted to consolidate his organization's power against the party and the army, but hesitated to release Heydrich from his direct control. An unexpected ally appeared in this context, Martin Bormann. For Bormann, sending Heydrich to Prague served to weaken the alliance between Himmler and his subordinate. Both knew it was a temporary alliance. To secure the position, Heydrich needed to convince Hitler that the situation in the Protectorate was critical. He deliberately exaggerated the threat of the Czech resistance, describing it as on the verge of general insurrection. Inflated reports of sabotage and disturbances created a sense of urgency. Karl Hermann Frank played a key role in this maneuver. Along with police chief Karl Böhm, he presented alarming evidence of Neurath's alleged passivity. Frank believed this would bring him to the pinnacle of power in Prague. He did not realize he was merely a piece in a larger plan. In September 1941, Frank traveled to Hitler's headquarters with a dossier against Neurath. On September 21st, he reported to the Führer, convinced he would return as the new Reichsprotector. That same day, Heydrich arrived with his own, more detailed file, demonstrating his control over the Czech situation. His presentation was decisive. Hitler concluded that tolerance had been interpreted as weakness. Neurath was sidelined under the excuse of a vacation, and Heydrich was appointed acting Reichsprotector. Upon arriving in Prague on September 27th, the Protectorate entered a new phase. The next day, the SS flag flew over Hradčany Castle. 4 days later, Heydrich outlined his program in a secret speech, a calculated combination of terror and concessions. His immediate goal was to crush all opposition and ensure industrial production for the war. His ultimate goal was the total Germanization of the territory. From day one, martial law was imposed. Special courts issued rapid sentences, almost always death or deportation. Executions targeted retired officers, intellectuals, and natural leaders of Czech society. Between September and November, thousands were detained. Over time, Heydrich reduced visible executions to create an illusion of normality while repression continued covertly. Underground networks were devastated. Communications with London were cut, and newly dropped agents were captured within weeks. By the end of 1941, the national resistance was practically dismantled as an organized force. Heydrich extended his offensive to the black market, blaming it for food shortages. He used executions for economic crimes to gain passive support and free agricultural resources. At the same time, he combined terror with material incentives for armaments factory workers. The goal was to depoliticize the population and reduce it to obedience. The offensive also reached the Czech government. Prime Minister Alois Elias was arrested and sentenced to death a few days after Heydrich's arrival. President Hácha, ill and weakened, was pressured into open collaboration. He participated in propaganda campaigns blaming London and Moscow for the violence. Heydrich celebrated having won him over to his cause. Meanwhile, the fate of Czech Jews was sealed. Even before the Wannsee Conference, Heydrich ordered the creation of the Theresienstadt ghetto as a preliminary step to deportations eastward. Tens of thousands were sent to extermination centers. Faced with this escalation of terror, London began to accept the conviction that the situation in the Protectorate required a visible response. Thus, the idea of a spectacular action was born, an assassination carried out by trained paratroopers, presented as an act of national resistance. Several targets were considered, but Heydrich was the ultimate symbol of Nazi terror. His death would have the greatest political impact. The operation was conceived in absolute secrecy. Benes left nothing in writing. He knew that an assassination would provoke reprisals, but terror was already underway, and the resistance was being annihilated. In his eyes, inaction meant accepting Czechoslovakia's political disappearance. The mission was named Anthropoid. 2 men were selected, Josef Gabčík and, after a substitution due to injury, Jan Kubis. They were trained to attack Heydrich's car with automatic weapons and explosives. The plan was simple: shoot at a curve where the vehicle would be forced to slow down. By late December 1941, after months of delays, the opportunity arrived. On the night of December 28th to 29th, the Halifax took off from England with several groups on board. Amid snow and darkness, the paratroopers were dropped over the Protectorate with limited precision. Shortly after 2 a.m., Gabčík and Kubis landed on the frozen ground of Bohemia. Their mission had just begun. Reinhard Heydrich continued consolidating his power, convinced that no one would dare challenge him. He did not know that his sentence was already underway. 10:32, a missed shot and the decisive explosion. The morning of May 27th dawned clear and bright. Gabčík and Kubis left the Ogun's apartment earlier than usual. They said nothing special and left no farewell signs. Each carried an old briefcase. Inside, hidden under layers of fresh grass, were their weapons, the Sten submachine gun disassembled into 3 parts and 2 armed bombs. Due to food shortages the previous year, many Czechs had collected grass in parks to feed rabbits, so no one was surprised to see someone carrying such a load. Both wore caps to disguise the color of their hair. Despite the good weather, Gabčík put on a light raincoat that would help conceal his hands while assembling the weapon. Josef Ogun would later recall seeing them calm. As they left, Gabčík casually told him not to worry if they didn't return at the usual time. They took a tram to Žižkov. There, they picked up bicycles and attached the briefcases to the handlebars. Shortly before 9, they arrived in Holešovice. They dismounted and leaned the bikes against 2 lampposts. Valkik was already there. After a brief conversation, he went up the hill and positioned himself beside the road with a small mirror to signal the arrival. Gabčík crouched, opened the briefcase, and, protected by the raincoat, assembled the Sten without looking. He crossed the street and positioned himself next to a small grassy mound near a tram stop. Kubis took a position on the other side of the curve, shielded by a lamppost and the shadow of trees. Everything was ready. In Panenské Brezany, Heydrich finished breakfast just before 9. His driver drove the convertible Mercedes to the castle entrance. Heydrich took his time leaving, strolling through the garden with his wife and playing with his children. It was almost 10 when the car departed for Prague. Heydrich sat in the front, next to the driver. As always, he had no escort. Both carried only their pistols. In Holešovice, traffic was thinning. Trams climbed and descended the hill. Tension mounted. If Heydrich had changed his schedule, the operation would be lost. Kubis crossed briefly to speak with Gabčík, but he signaled him to return to his post. At 10:32, Valkik's mirror reflected the signal. The car was at the top, beginning the descent. Gabčík advanced toward the curve. Kubis took out one of the bombs. At that moment, a tram began to ascend from the Troja bridge. There was no turning back. The Mercedes slowed. Gabčík dropped the raincoat, raised the Sten, and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. The car passed by. Heydrich then made his critical mistake. Instead of fleeing, he shouted to the driver to stop. The car braked. Kubis stepped out of the shadows and threw the bomb. The projectile exploded near the rear wheel. Metal and upholstery fragments flew through the air. The car was enveloped in smoke. Heydrich and Klein jumped from the Mercedes with pistols drawn. Klein ran toward Kubis, who was bleeding from the face. Heydrich advanced uphill toward Gabčík. Kubis managed to mount his bicycle and escape among the crowd. Klein tried to reach him, but his gun jammed. Kubis fled to a safe house, changed clothes, and was convinced the mission had failed. Gabčík had more difficulty. He exchanged fire with Heydrich, who took cover behind the tram. Suddenly, Heydrich doubled over in pain. The bomb had gravely wounded him. Gabčík took the opportunity to flee uphill. Klein returned to assist his superior. Heydrich collapsed near the car. Gabčík hid in a butcher shop. The owner, a Nazi sympathizer, reported him. Klein entered the shop. They faced each other. Gabčík shot him in the legs and managed to escape. Later, he reached another refuge, tidied his hair, and limped, convinced the Sten had betrayed him. At the attack site, a woman recognized Heydrich and called for help. After several attempts, he was transported by truck to Bulovka Hospital. He arrived conscious shortly after 11. Doctors found a broken rib, a damaged diaphragm, and fragments embedded in the spleen. Surgery was performed that same day. In the following days, his condition worsened. The infection spread. Treatment could not stop the sepsis. In the early hours of June 4th, Heydrich died. The medical record was brief and direct: wound infection. His death unleashed massive reprisals, executions, and raids that paralyzed the protectorate. Meanwhile, Gabčík and Kubis, hiding with other paratroopers, understood that the assassination had succeeded, but the cost would be devastating. Betrayal and the final siege, from Pécsek Palace to the flooded crypt. The nervous man who arrived at Pécsek Palace was immediately taken before Heinz Panwitz, head of the German commission investigating the attack. He could barely speak clearly due to spasms and stammering, but the Gestapo quickly realized the value of this unexpected testimony when he was able to identify among 20 identical briefcases Josef Gabčík's. He recognized it by a visible tear on the side. According to the interrogation report, his statement was considered extremely important from the outset. He claimed to have seen that briefcase before the attack at the Svatos family apartment in the hands of a parachute agent. He added that inside there had been an English submachine gun, a weapon he knew well. Witness descriptions matched this agent, leading investigators to focus on Josef Gabčík, whose code name was Zdeněk, a former resident near Žilina. He also expressed suspicion that the second attacker was Jan Kubis, known as Ot Navratil. Both names were previously unknown to the Germans. Panwitz, surprised by the level of detail, suspected that the informant had also been a paratrooper. Upon searching him, agents found a standard object issued to SOE members, prompting further intense interrogations. Later, the informant recounted that he was shown photographs of several paratroopers and recognized them all, including Lieutenant Pechal, Kolarik, Mix, and Gerich, though he initially denied knowing them. After being beaten, he admitted he knew them and revealed that he himself had been parachuted on March 27, 1942, near Telk in Moravia. He claimed he had surrendered to protect his family and because he was disillusioned with the Czech government in exile. He could not lead the Gestapo directly to the culprits because he did not know their hideout, but he disclosed several safe houses used by the Jindra group. The most important was the Moravec family apartment in Žižkov, a central point of the network. Panwitz ordered surveillance, and at 5 a.m. on June 17th, the police raided the buildings in a coordinated operation. The Moravecs were awakened by violent knocks and German shouts. During the apartment search, Mrs. Moravec asked to use the bathroom. Once inside, she locked herself and did not emerge alive. When the police forced entry, she was dead. Her husband and son were taken out of the building, still in their pajamas. That same day, Zelenka was found in his apartment and killed before capture. With no other results, the Gestapo focused on Ata Moravec. He was taken to the Pécsek Palace basement, where he was tortured for hours. At the height of his exhaustion, he was intoxicated and shown his mother's head in a fishbowl. Broken, he revealed that she had told him to go to the catacombs of St. Charles Borromeo Church if ever in danger. Late that night, Panwitz mobilized Prague authorities to obtain blueprints of the temple without success. A double cordon was established around the area, using over 700 Waffen-SS men. Sewers, rooftops, and access points were monitored with explicit orders to capture the men alive. At 4:10 a.m. on June 18th, trucks carrying Waffen-SS troops arrived at the church. 5 minutes later, a Gestapo team entered, greeted by the sacristan. The main nave was empty. but forcing the gate to the choir caused a grenade to roll down the stairs and explode. At the same time, gunfire came from above. The explosion wounded a German and darkened much of the temple. SS shots from the rooftops shattered windows and caused fires in the altar decorations. Panwitz ordered a retreat to avoid friendly fire casualties. The SS attempted to take the choir via the narrow staircase. The fight lasted 2 hours. Eventually, they found 2 paratroopers dead from internal causes and a third severely wounded Jan Kubis, who later died in the hospital. The other 2 bodies belonged to Bublik and Opalka. Failing to find Gabčík, they interrogated Father Vladimir Petrek, who indicated a hidden entrance to the crypt. Panwitz tried to negotiate surrender via loudspeakers, promising treatment as prisoners of war. The trapped men responded that they were Czechs and would not surrender. They attempted to flood the crypt using Prague firefighters. The hoses were cut or refused under fire. Tear gas grenades were also used, sometimes thrown back. When Karl Hermann Frank arrived, he demanded an immediate solution. Against Panwitz's opposition, he ordered an assault. Troops advanced through water and gas, but were repelled. Finally, a second entrance was breached with explosives. Before the attack began, 4 shots were heard. Upon entry, soldiers found the 4 men dead, with gunshot wounds to the temples. They had chosen not to surrender, bringing the confrontation to its final conclusion. The bodies were removed to the street. Among the weapons found were the 2 Colt revolvers used in the attack. Gabčík was identified at the scene. 3 days later, Bartos of the Silver. A group was located and died after a shootout. His radio operator, Potuček, was killed on July 2nd. The village of Lezaki, which had hidden the transmitter, was destroyed on June 24th. Adults were executed and children separated. Only 2 were deemed suitable for Germanization. Reprisals continued through the summer. Between late May and early September 1942, over 3,000 Czechs were arrested and more than 1,300 executed. In addition were the deported Jews and relatives of the paratroopers, many of whom were killed in Mauthausen. The Orthodox clergy were condemned and the church was dissolved in the Protectorate. Karol Kurda received 5 million crowns for his betrayal, adopted German citizenship, and actively collaborated with the Gestapo until the end of the war. During the remainder of the occupation, the Nazi regime turned Heydrich into a symbol. Foundations were created, streets renamed, and propaganda events organized. In June 1943, a bust was inaugurated at the attack site, and stamps featuring his image were issued. In Berlin, his funeral was presented as the Reich's grandest tribute. However, after the war, the perpetrators were tried. Karl Hermann Frank was executed in May 1946. Kurt Dalueger followed months later. Kurda was captured in 1945 and hanged after declaring no remorse. For years, the paratroopers' role was silenced. Only a small memorial in the church remembered their resistance. Over time, their story resurfaced, not as propaganda, but as the record of an operation that ended in a flooded crypt, with 4 final shots marking the mission's closure.